Suffering is the one experience we all share, yet it remains one of life's greatest mysteries. From the loss of loved ones to physical pain, from injustice to personal failure, suffering cuts across time, culture, and belief. Philosophers and religious thinkers have long grappled with its meaning, asking whether pain is punishment, a test, or simply an unavoidable part of existence. For some, suffering reveals the fragility of human life, a constant reminder of our vulnerability. For others, it is the very ground where resilience, compassion, and meaning are forged. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus once argued that we cannot choose our external circumstances, but we can always choose how we respond to them. His words suggest that while suffering is inevitable, despair is not. In Buddhism, suffering, or dukkha, is seen as a central truth of existence, but one that can lead to liberation when understood. In Christianity, suffering is often interpreted as a sharing in Christ's pain, a pathway to redemption and deeper faith. Hindu philosophy considers suffering part of the karmic cycle, a reality intertwined with growth, learning, and eventual liberation. Psychology, too, reminds us that pain can shape identity, strengthen resilience, and fuel creativity. Yet these perspectives do not erase the raw experience of suffering. They only frame it, offering different lenses through which we might endure and understand. At its core, the question remains, is suffering merely an accident of existence, or does it point toward something deeper? In this exploration, we seek not easy answers, but honest reflection. Suffering may not be avoidable, but perhaps it can be meaningful. The reality of suffering is inescapable. From the moment of birth, where both mother and child endure pain, to the final moments of life, pain marks the human journey. Across history, no society or individual has ever been free of suffering. Wars, natural disasters, illnesses, and personal tragedies all testify to its universality. The Buddha recognized this when he proclaimed that life is characterized by dukkha, a term that encompasses not only suffering, but dissatisfaction and unease. This recognition was not meant as despair, but as a starting point for understanding life more fully. Similarly, Christianity acknowledges suffering as part of the fallen human condition, but frames it as a space where God's grace can enter. Hindu philosophy teaches that suffering is deeply tied to karma, the moral fabric that binds actions and consequences across lifetimes. Yet even outside religious contexts, suffering is unavoidable. Existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus argued that suffering is part of the absurdity of life, an unavoidable tension we must learn to live with. Medical science also reminds us that pain serves a purpose. It alerts us to injury, protects us from harm, and signals when something is wrong. Without pain, survival itself would be threatened. But this biological explanation does not erase the emotional and spiritual weight of suffering. Instead, it deepens the paradox. Suffering is both destructive and instructive. The challenge, then, is not whether we will suffer, but how we will respond. Buddhism confronts suffering head-on. The First Noble Truth teaches that dukkha, or suffering, is an inevitable part of life. This includes not only obvious pain, but the dissatisfaction that arises even in comfort and success. According to the Buddha, the root of suffering lies in craving, our endless desire for what we lack and our fear of losing what we have. This perspective reframes suffering, not as punishment, but as a condition tied to desire and attachment. Liberation, then, is not about eliminating pain, but about transforming our relationship with it. The path of mindfulness, meditation, and ethical living allows one to see suffering clearly and respond with wisdom rather than resistance. Unlike some religious interpretations, Buddhism does not assign blame for suffering. It does not suggest divine punishment or moral failure. Instead, it recognizes suffering as universal, a condition of being alive. In this sense, Buddhism is profoundly compassionate. If suffering is shared by all, so too is the path to freedom. Modern psychology has echoed this idea, with practices like mindfulness-based stress reduction rooted in Buddhist teachings. By acknowledging suffering directly rather than avoiding it, we create space for healing and growth. This perspective challenges the instinct to deny or suppress pain. Instead, it calls us to face it with awareness, courage, and compassion. For Buddhism, suffering is not the end of the story, but the beginning of wisdom. Christianity offers a very different lens on suffering. Here, pain is often framed as redemptive, a sharing in the suffering of Christ. For believers, this interpretation provides meaning even in the darkest experiences. The crucifixion itself becomes the ultimate symbol, immense suffering transformed into salvation. The Apostle Paul wrote, "We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and character produces hope." These words highlight suffering not as meaningless agony, but as a crucible for transformation. Many Christian traditions see suffering as a way of participating in God's work, joining one's pain to the redemptive suffering of Jesus. This does not erase the anguish of grief, illness, or injustice, but it situates suffering in a cosmic story of hope. For some, this perspective brings deep comfort, suggesting that no pain is wasted. Critics, however, warn that this framing can sometimes encourage passivity, accepting suffering rather than resisting injustice. Yet the Christian response to suffering is not uniform. It also includes powerful traditions of service, charity, and healing, which see alleviating suffering as a sacred duty. Mother Teresa, for example, saw Christ in the suffering poor, making compassion itself a form of encountering God. In this light, suffering becomes not only personal but communal, calling forth empathy and solidarity. Christianity's message is not that suffering is good, but that it can be transformed. In the story of the cross, pain is never the final word. Resurrection is. Hindu philosophy locates suffering within the vast framework of karma. Karma is not merely punishment or reward, but the natural unfolding of cause and effect across lifetimes. In this view, suffering may arise from past actions, but it also provides opportunities for learning, growth, and eventual liberation. Unlike philosophies that see suffering as random, Hinduism interprets it as deeply interconnected with the soul's journey. The Bhagavad Gita offers a profound dialogue on this theme, as Krishna teaches Arjuna that even suffering can serve a higher purpose. The Gita reminds us that life's struggles, while painful, are never without meaning in the cosmic order. For some, this belief offers comfort, suggesting that suffering is not senseless, but part of a path toward moksha or liberation. Others, however, raise concerns. Does this interpretation risk justifying inequality or excusing injustice by attributing suffering to past karma? Hindu thinkers themselves have debated this tension, emphasizing the importance of compassion and duty alongside karmic law. In practice, Hindu traditions encourage service, devotion, and detachment, recognizing that while suffering exists, our response defines our spiritual progress. Modern Hindu teachers often stress that suffering is not punishment, but an invitation to deeper understanding of the self and the divine. In this way, suffering is both personal and universal, both a weight and a teacher. The karmic view of suffering reminds us that pain is never isolated. It belongs to the larger story of existence itself. The philosophical problem of evil asks, if God is all good and all powerful, why does suffering exist? This paradox has haunted Western philosophy and theology for centuries. Epicurus famously argued that either God is unable to prevent suffering, in which case he is not omnipotent, or unwilling, in which case he is not benevolent. This sharp reasoning continues to challenge religious faith today. Augustine of Hippo responded by framing suffering as the result of human free will, not divine cruelty. Evil, he argued, is not a thing in itself, but the absence of good. Later, philosophers like Leibniz suggested that this world, despite suffering, is the best of all possible worlds. For critics, such explanations often fall short, unable to account for extreme suffering, especially innocent suffering. Modern existentialists like Camus rejected these frameworks entirely, declaring that suffering proves the universe is indifferent to human hope. And yet, even in Camus' bleak view, the response to suffering becomes meaningful. We must rebel by affirming life in spite of its pain. The problem of evil thus remains unresolved, bridging faith, reason, and defiance. It challenges us to reconcile the experience of suffering with the hope of meaning. Whether or not there is a final answer, the question itself forces us to wrestle with the deepest tensions of existence. In this struggle, perhaps meaning is not found in answers, but in the search itself. Philosophy and psychology often converge on one insight. Suffering, though painful, can also shape human growth. Friedrich Nietzsche declared, "That which does not kill us makes us stronger," highlighting suffering as a forge for resilience. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, echoed this in Man's Search for Meaning, observing that those who found meaning in suffering were better able to endure it. Suffering forces us to confront our limits, but also our capacity to endure. It strips away illusions and reveals what truly matters. In this process, suffering often awakens empathy, allowing us to connect more deeply with the pain of others. Without suffering, could we truly understand compassion? Psychological studies confirm that post-traumatic growth is real. Many people emerge from hardship with greater clarity, gratitude, or strength. Yet this is not universal. Suffering can also crush, isolate, and scar. The difference often lies in support, perspective, and the ability to make meaning. This is why Frankl insisted that the last freedom is to choose one's attitude towards suffering. Suffering thus becomes a paradox, destructive yet potentially transformative. While no one seeks pain, it can become a strange kind of teacher. The challenge is not to glorify suffering, but to recognize the possibilities it contains. In facing suffering, we may discover a deeper, more resilient self. Albert Camus, the French existentialist, rejected the idea that suffering has inherent meaning. For him, life is absurd. We crave purpose, but the universe offers none. The myth of Sisyphus captures this vision. Condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, Sisyphus embodies the endless struggle of human existence. Yet Camus insists we must imagine Sisyphus happy. The act of defiance, of embracing life even without ultimate meaning, becomes its own kind of triumph. Suffering in this view is not explained away, but accepted as part of life's absurdity. Camus argued that seeking meaning in suffering risks illusion, but embracing the struggle affirms our freedom. This perspective is challenging. It strips suffering of cosmic justification, but it also frees us from false comfort. In a sense, it calls us to courage, to live fully in spite of suffering. For Camus, rebellion is not despair but vitality. By affirming life against the indifference of the universe, we give our own meaning to suffering. His philosophy resonates with those who find strength not in answers, but in endurance. The absurd does not eliminate suffering, but it transforms our stance toward it. We are no longer victims of meaninglessness, but authors of our response. In embracing the absurd, Camus suggests we embrace life itself. Viktor Frankl's work in logotherapy emphasizes that meaning-making is essential for enduring pain. He observed that even in extreme suffering, such as in concentration camps, individuals who found a sense of purpose were more likely to survive mentally and physically. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, also teaches that reframing thoughts about suffering can reduce distress and promote resilience. Neuroscience supports this, showing that perspective and emotional regulation influence how the brain experiences pain. Conversely, chronic suffering without coping strategies can lead to depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Psychologists also recognize that suffering is context-dependent. Cultural, social, and personal factors shape how pain is perceived. While science may not assign ultimate meaning to suffering, it provides tools to manage its impact and integrate it into life. Pain becomes more bearable when accompanied by understanding, social support, and purposeful action. Modern approaches echo philosophical insights. While we may not control suffering itself, we can shape our response. Awareness and reflection allow us to transform passive suffering into active engagement. Therapy, meditation, and journaling are all practical techniques for doing so. Suffering, then, becomes both a challenge and an opportunity for personal growth. Understanding the psychological dimension complements religious and philosophical perspectives, giving a more complete picture. Ultimately, Psychology reminds us that human beings are capable of adapting to hardship while still seeking meaning. Chronic illness transforms suffering into a long-term companion. Unlike acute pain, which often has a clear cause and resolution, chronic illness imposes ongoing challenges on body, mind, and spirit. Patients face limitations, uncertainty, and repeated disappointments. Yet some find that enduring illness strengthens their capacity for empathy, patience, and reflection. Studies show that meaning-making and spiritual or philosophical frameworks improve quality of life for those with chronic conditions. For instance, individuals with chronic pain who engage in mindfulness or religious practices report less emotional distress. The suffering of illness also challenges social relationships, work life, and identity, prompting reflection on who we are outside of physical health. The Stoics emphasize that while we cannot always control our circumstances, we can control our reactions, an insight particularly relevant to chronic illness. Viktor Frankl's lessons apply here as well. The search for meaning is critical in navigating unavoidable hardship. Painful experiences can highlight what truly matters and encourage reevaluation of priorities. Chronic suffering forces introspection about resilience, purpose, and connection. It also raises ethical questions about care, accessibility, and the role of empathy in society. Recognizing the universal presence of suffering, even in extreme forms, can foster solidarity and compassion. Philosophical reflection can provide the tools to interpret chronic suffering as part of a larger human narrative. Understanding pain scientifically, psychologically, and spiritually can transform it from a purely negative experience into a catalyst for growth. While suffering can provide opportunities for growth, some experiences appear beyond comprehension. Natural disasters, genocide, or profound loss often challenge our capacity to find meaning. Philosophers and theologians alike wrestle with the problem of horrendous suffering. Immanuel Kant suggested that moral and ethical reflection can help us confront such extremes. Yet even Kant admitted that some suffering defies explanation. Viktor Frankl observed that while not all suffering can be avoided, the attitude toward it can still confer meaning. Existentialists, like Camus, remind us that even in the face of absurd or extreme suffering, engagement with life itself is the response. Religious frameworks, too, attempt to provide solace. Buddhism teaches detachment and insight. Christianity emphasizes redemption, and Hinduism frames suffering in the karmic cycle. Psychological interventions aim to support individuals navigating overwhelming suffering, emphasizing resilience, therapy, and community support. However, we must acknowledge that some suffering remains deeply traumatic and resists rationalization. Awareness of this limitation is itself a philosophical stance, urging humility. Understanding the limits of meaning can help society respond with empathy rather than judgment. It also underscores the responsibility of caregivers, therapists, and community members in alleviating suffering. In the end, confrontation with extreme suffering calls for courage, reflection, and sometimes simply bearing witness. Even when meaning is elusive, the human capacity to endure, connect, and care remains vital. One of suffering's paradoxical gifts is the cultivation of compassion. Those who experience pain often develop deeper empathy for others. This has been documented both historically and in psychological studies of post-traumatic growth. Religious traditions highlight this connection. Christ's suffering encourages believers to serve the poor and afflicted. Buddhism emphasizes karuna, the cultivation of compassion through recognition of shared suffering. Hindu teachings similarly encourage seva, or selfless service, as a response to personal and communal suffering. Experiencing adversity can heighten sensitivity to injustice, prompting moral and ethical action. Philosophers argue that empathy born from suffering enriches social cohesion and community resilience. In this way, pain becomes not only personal but relational, connecting us to others in profound ways. Compassion derived from suffering challenges the notion that suffering is purely negative. It creates opportunities for moral development, societal responsibility, and emotional depth. Acknowledging shared suffering fosters understanding across differences and strengthens human bonds. Even in the midst of personal hardship, acts of kindness and solidarity can emerge. Suffering, paradoxically, can expand the capacity for love. In confronting pain, humans often find the power to care, connect, and heal. Literature and art are powerful outlets for exploring and making sense of suffering. Writers like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Virginia Woolf have captured the complexities of pain, revealing how it shapes character and society. Viktor Frankl's writings show how narrative can help process trauma and loss. In visual art, Picasso's Guernica portrays the anguish of war with stark, unforgettable imagery. These works serve both as personal catharsis and collective testimony. They allow audiences to witness suffering, creating empathy and understanding. Artistic expression can give structure to chaos, making intangible pain tangible. Music, poetry, and theater also function similarly, providing avenues to reflect on loss, injustice, and human fragility. Philosophers argue that art transforms suffering, allowing individuals to confront it rather than evade it. The process of creation itself can offer meaning, connecting personal pain to broader human experience. Art communicates that suffering is not isolated, bridging individual and communal experiences. In engaging with artistic representations of suffering, viewers gain perspective, emotional release, and insight. These mediums also foster dialogue about social issues, ethics, and human resilience. Ultimately, literature and art show that while suffering may be inevitable, its interpretation is not fixed. Through creativity, humans assert agency over the pain that life imposes. Resilience is the human capacity to endure, adapt, and sometimes even thrive in the face of suffering. Psychologists define it as the ability to recover from hardship while maintaining or regaining psychological well-being. Philosophers like Nietzsche and Frankl emphasize that resilience often emerges precisely because of struggle. Hope acts as a vital companion to resilience, motivating individuals to continue despite pain. Religious teachings frequently reinforce this, presenting suffering as a temporary stage en route to redemption, liberation, or enlightenment. Resilience is both personal and relational, shaped by community, support networks, and social structures. Stories of survival, courage, and perseverance illustrate the remarkable capacities of the human spirit. Even in contexts of extreme trauma, humans often demonstrate unexpected creativity, strength, and solidarity. Cultivating resilience does not deny the reality of suffering. It acknowledges it and finds ways to navigate it effectively. Practices such as reflection, mindfulness, and purposeful action strengthen resilience. Education and exposure to philosophy can equip individuals to interpret pain constructively. Hope sustains, guides, and inspires choices that transform adversity into growth. Recognizing our resilience can empower us to engage meaningfully with life's difficulties. Pain may remain unavoidable, but it need not define or destroy us. By embracing resilience and hope, suffering becomes part of the ongoing narrative of life, rather than its conclusion. This slide lists resources for deeper exploration of suffering, meaning, and resilience. C.S. Lewis's The Problem of Pain provides a Christian philosophical perspective, exploring why a good God allows suffering. Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning combines memoir and psychology, showing the power of purpose in surviving extreme adversity. Harold Kushner's When Bad Things Happen to Good People addresses grief and injustice from a compassionate, philosophical lens. The Dhammapada and Bhagavad Gita offer Buddhist and Hindu perspectives, emphasizing mindfulness, karma, and ethical reflection. Podcasts like On Being explore modern philosophical and spiritual conversations about pain. The Happiness Lab examines psychological research on adversity and resilience. Philosophy Bites discusses suffering, ethics, and the human condition with expert philosophers. Each resource contributes unique insight, historical, philosophical, religious, or psychological. Exploring these sources can expand understanding, cultivate empathy, and provide practical tools for coping. They bridge theory and lived experience, offering frameworks for interpreting suffering. They also invite personal reflection and dialogue, Engaging with these materials supports intellectual and emotional growth. In sum, these resources empower viewers to confront suffering thoughtfully and compassionately. They remind us that while pain is universal, understanding and meaning are available to all. As we conclude, we return to the central question: is there meaning in suffering? Across cultures, philosophies, and religions, humans have sought answers. Some see suffering as unavoidable, yet rich with potential for growth. Others frame it as a test, a redemptive process, or part of a cosmic moral order. Psychology and neuroscience show us how interpretation, coping, and resilience shape the human experience of pain. Art, literature, and storytelling transform suffering into insight, connecting individual and collective lives. Even when meaning is elusive, endurance, reflection, and empathy remain possibilities. Suffering can challenge, deepen, and transform us if approached with awareness. We are reminded that the human response, compassion, creativity, and moral action is as important as the suffering itself. Consider, can pain be a teacher rather than a tyrant? How do different traditions guide us in confronting adversity? Which perspectives resonate with your own experience? Is suffering ultimately personal, communal, or universal? By contemplating these questions, we participate in a dialogue that stretches across time, culture, and belief. Suffering may not have a singular answer, but our engagement with it reveals our humanity. The final reflection is simple yet profound. What will we do with the pain we encounter?